Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today we'll be talking about the great catastrophe of the human psyche, and at the end, a little bit about its great hope. You'll remember last time we were making our way through this passage of Plato's Phaedrus, in which Socrates is explaining to the young Phaedrus the nature of the psyche using a myth. And we encountered this idea of there being a kind of primal state of the psyche, one in which it enjoyed a kind of bliss. It enjoyed bliss itself, and also a freedom, I think, symbolized in its wings. The psyche has wings in this myth. And this reminded us, or reminded me, of this Joni Mitchell song from 1969, and generally of an almost kind of new age or age of Aquarius concept of human being in its purity. This idea that in some way, difficult to describe in ordinary words, the psyche is fundamentally good and at one with nature, with the cosmos. We are stardust, we are golden. And we talked about how this idea in our own time has been ridiculed as it doesn't seem to accommodate the reality of negativity or evil. Well, in Plato, this isn't the case. Human vice and unhappiness are certainly recognized, and they have a cause. And this is what we'll be starting to talk about today. For Plato, our current or everyday state is the result of a great tragedy, a fall of the psyche. We're moving in mythic language here, of course, and Plato puts this tragedy in terms of the psyche losing its wings and becoming united with a body. Quote, "So long as its wings are in perfect condition, it flies high," he writes, "and the entire universe is its dominion. But a soul that sheds its wings wanders until it lights on something solid, where it settles and takes on an earthly body, which then, owing to the power of this soul, seems to move itself. The whole combination of soul and body is called a living thing or animal, and has the designation mortal as well." So for Plato, the downfall of the psyche is its taking on a body. What does he mean by this? As I've mentioned in an earlier episode, Plato's apparent hostility toward the body and the sensible can seem to cloud or shroud his teaching in a kind of deep melancholy. And this is also why I think it was so repugnant to Nietzsche, even though, speaking for myself, I find it kind of hard to read Nietzsche without detecting a kind of almost Socrato-Platonic spirit there. But that's perhaps a topic for another day. Anyway, Plato seems in places to see the body as the cause of desires that distract the psyche from its pursuit of the good. This is which is of course its true happiness, as we saw. This is a big theme in his dialogue, the Phaedo, for example. Body, Socrates says in that dialogue, is, quote, "an impediment which by its presence prevents the soul from attaining to truth and clear thinking," unquote. And he goes on to deliver a kind of invective against the body. He goes on at some length. Quote, "The body fills us with loves and desires and fears and all sorts of fancies and a great deal of nonsense," he says. And in a way, this can seem kind of morbid if we stick to this surface in a way that can seem kind of morbid if we stick to this surface understanding. He even seems to suggest that death, since it involves the separation of the soul from the body, is a good thing. As I've said before in this series, however, I don't think melancholy really has the last word in Plato. I think that if we penetrate the imagery Plato uses here, we can in a way, digest and be enriched by what he's saying through this mythic language. And I think what Plato is getting at by the image of this fall is the idea of not a literal union of soul and body, but a lapse of the self into a certain kind of cognition. I don't think that when Plato speaks of the body and the sensible as bad for the soul, he really means the body in a literal sense. In fact, it would be hard to argue that when he's talking about the divine in us, this mania sent by the gods, he's not talking about some kind of experiential oneness of body and soul, mind and feeling. For example, the obvious involvement of body and feeling in all these forms of mania, religious practices and poetic inspiration, and most of all, of course, eros itself. These all clearly involve the body. One thing that I think is important in this connection, and I've touched on it before in this series, is how our present day sort of secularized interest in unitive experiences seems to have been influenced, at least to some degree, by modern Westerners' discovery of Eastern, chiefly Hindu and Buddhist philosophies. And I think one especially significant result of this encounter has been a shift in the way we, or at least many of us, speak of the body and of its role in this, in the unitive or ecstatic. The development of secular paths to oneness through mindfulness has involved the development of techniques, of course, that use the body, in fact, for which the body, of course, is pretty much indispensable. The meditation on the breath, for example. This attitude toward the body seems at first glance different from Plato's, as we saw. But I think it's important to keep two things in mind here. One is that the Phaedo is, of course, the dialogue that tells the story of Socrates drinking the poisonous hemlock while philosophizing with his friends. And we can take his argument here, his depiction of death as the soul's release from the bondage of the body, as perhaps intended as a kind of consolation for them. Second, and I think more importantly, I think if we look closely at what Plato says when he talks about the body's bad effects on the soul, we see that he's actually talking about mental activity, judgment of some kind. Judgment about what is to be desired or feared, for example, in the passage from the Phaedo I mentioned a few minutes ago, when he talks about the soul, the body is responsible for all these desires and fears. He speaks there and elsewhere of the senses being the cause of error, and in Book 10 of the Republic we see him give an example of this. The same things seeming curved when partly submerged in water and then straight when out of it. But of course, any kind of error requires judgment of some kind. We're using the mind when we judge whether something is straight or curved. We're using abstractions. So when Plato talks about the influence of the body, he really seems to mean a certain kind of activity of mind or a certain kind of consciousness. And it seems to me to be this, one in which we are making judgments, for example, formulating objectives for ourselves, conceiving of objects of desire, in a way that does not involve the whole person, you could say, or our consciousness of the one. It is the conceiving of objects of desire purely as part of an objectifying process, purely as part of a thinking that has basically declared its independence from oneness and has decided to, in a way, operate on its own, to conceive of its objects as mere objects, outside of the context of reality in its wholeness. He uses the image of a charioteer driving two horses, one of which is unruly and wants to go its own way. In short, I think the body, for Plato, is objectification. The loss of our wings is a lapse into pure objectification. This interpretation is also what we see, I think, in the interpreters of Plato, the countless Platonists and Neoplatonists that followed in his footsteps for so many centuries after his death. Plotinus, for example, talks about the fall of human psyches as a kind of prideful separation of the self from the whole. He writes, quote, "The starting point for their evil is, then, audacity, generation, primary difference, and their willing that they belong to themselves. They appeared actually to take pleasure in their autonomy and to have made much use of their self-motion, running in the opposite direction and getting as far away from home as possible. And somehow part of this self-separation is a kind of lack of confidence of accepting the whole or the one. It's as though the psyche fears opening itself up to reality as a whole, as a kind of stepping out into an abyss in which it would have nothing to hold on to. And so it develops a kind of dependence on pure subject-object thinking. And he writes, "Our cognition relies on forms. And so the more the soul moves towards what is formless, the one, it glances off the object and is afraid it will have nothing, since it is completely incapable of comprehending the object on account of not being limited by, and in a way given an impression by, the variegation of the thing making the impression. For this reason, in such a situation, it gets weary and takes pleasure in descending from all these things until it reaches sensible, solid reality, which provides a kind of relief. The one in mind, the one as it exists in pure mind, I think he's talking about, or mind as an emanation from the one. And we see as what the soul kind of fears. And we see both of these themes, pride and also this, I think, quite difficult concept to explain in ordinary language, self-separation, described also in the Christian Neoplatonist St. Augustine, who in his Confessions show how he must have read Plotinus because there are so many echoes of Plotinian passages in there. Anyway, he writes in his great work on the Trinity, quote, "The soul, loving its own power, slides away from the whole, which is common to all, into the part which is its own private property. It strives to grab something more than the whole, and to govern it by its own laws. And because there is nothing more than the whole, it is thrust back into anxiety over a part. And so by being greedy for more, it gets less." So this is really sort of something, as I said, that's hard to describe in ordinary words. But it seems to be one of those themes that seems to crop up. And speaking of the daimon of Plato voicing itself in the song of our time, it's striking to me how this song, Fodder on Her Wings, by the jazz pianist, singer, and songwriter Nina Simone, the high priestess of soul, also strangely echoes these themes from the Phaedrus. It tells of a reincarnated bird that falls to earth with tainted wings and a sort of inner emptiness. She had fodder in her wings, she had dust inside her brain. The bird flits here and there, retracing the songwriter's own itinerary, the United States, Switzerland, France, and observing the people in these countries grappling with life, sees that they have, quote, forgotten how to give, unquote. And the reason for that is that, like her, they have, quote, fodder in their wings and dust inside their brains. Giving, of course, is the outward manifestation of the unitive state, the state that transcends the subject-object divide. In giving, we wish the good to the other. And she's talking, I think, also about really giving in the most fundamental sense, like not giving objects, but giving self, sharing the self with the other. We have forgotten how to give. Simone sings in the song of a universal psychic lapse, seen in both herself and others, that is almost unspeakably sad, a kind of infinite spiritual loss or psychic loss. Oh, how sad, she repeats 3 times. And then she says, quel pays, at the end, what a country. She didn't have a good time in Switzerland, although she could mean the United States here because she wasn't always, she didn't speak very fondly of her home country. Anyway, so one overriding theme that we have here is a kind of indictment of the psyche, that it falls through some kind of vice. And in a way, it might seem to be an indictment of thinking, since thinking involves this subject-object relationship. This could be what Plato and the Platonists might seem to be getting at. But there's another aspect, actually, to Plato's myth of the fall of the psyche that is not judgmental in this way, I don't think, but in fact shows massive compassion to human nature. And it's massively important to the Platonic hope that I keep talking about in this series. This, I think, is the great redemptive hope of thought. It's what differentiates Plato from the sort of extreme, and I think ultimately quite sad, anti-thought mindfulness dogma of an Eckhart Tolle, whom I talked about very early on in this series. Anyway, I look forward to starting to talk about that next time. I hope you can join me then. And until then, be well, and thanks for watching.